In the final decade of the 19th century, the United States stood in the middle of a sudden and largely unplanned mechanical infatuation. Cities were expanding faster than their transit systems could follow. Paved roads remained scarce outside dense urban cores, and the horse, for all its long service, was proving expensive, slow, and difficult to keep in growing metropolitan centers. Into that gap came a simple two-wheeled machine that had been refined in Europe over several decades, the safety bicycle, with its chain drive, equal-sized wheels, and pneumatic tires. By the early 1990s, American manufacturing capacity, fed by a deep pool of skilled immigrant labor and an expanding rail network for distribution, was positioned to take that European design and produce it at a scale the continent had not yet seen. Chicago, already a hub of metalworking, meatpacking, and rail logistics, was one of the cities best equipped to do it. The bicycle craze that swept the country between roughly 1890 and 1897 was not a niche enthusiasm. It reorganized how millions of Americans thought about personal mobility, recreation, and even courtship and dress reform. And it created, almost overnight, a market hungry for a reliable domestic manufacturer who could meet demand without the defects that plagued many rushed competitors. Ignaz Schwinn, born in Hardheim in the Grand Duchy of Baden in 1860, arrived in the United States in 1891 after training as a mechanical engineer and working in the German bicycle and later early automobile industries. He brought with him a specific technical formation, an understanding of frame geometry, metallurgy, and precision tooling that few American manufacturers of the period could match. In Chicago, he found a financial partner in Adolf Frederick William Arnold, a meatpacking executive with capital to invest and no bicycle industry experience of his own. Together, they incorporated Arnold, Schwinn and Company in 1895, with Schwinn handling engineering and production, and Arnold providing the funding base that allowed the company to acquire equipment and secure a manufacturing site on Chicago's North Side. The timing placed the new firm directly inside the most intense years of the national bicycle boom, and the partnership's first bicycles entered a Chicago market that, according to multiple historical accounts, already contained somewhere close to 90 competing manufacturers. The bicycle boom that had given Arnold, Schwinn and Company its opening collapsed almost as quickly as it had risen. By the end of the 1890s, national demand for bicycles fell sharply as the novelty wore off, as the automobile began to capture the imagination of wealthier buyers, and as a glut of manufacturers, many of them undercapitalized, drove prices down and pushed weaker firms into bankruptcy or consolidation. The majority of Chicago's bicycle makers did not survive this contraction. Arnold, Schwinn and Company did, in large part because Ignaz Schwinn kept the firm's production standards and unit costs disciplined, even as competitors cut corners to chase volume, and because Arnold's capital provided a buffer that smaller family-financed shops did not have. Schwinn also diversified the company's output during the lean years that followed, briefly producing components and complete machines for the emerging motorcycle trade, which kept its tooling and workforce active when bicycle orders alone could not. By 1908, Ignaz Schwinn had bought out Arnold's ownership stake entirely, becoming sole proprietor of a company that had outlasted the great majority of its original Chicago competitors, not through dramatic intervention, but through a sustained refusal to compromise on the mechanical integrity of what it built. Having survived the shakeout, the company spent the 1910s and 1920s establishing the reputation that would define it for the rest of the century. A bicycle that was heavier, more expensive, and more durable than most of its competitors' offerings, built to survive years of regular use on American streets that were, at the time, frequently unpaved. The company's early signature was less a single-named model than a manufacturing philosophy. frames brazed and finished to tighter tolerances, components sourced or built to standards that reduced field failures, and a dealer network trained to service what it sold rather than simply move inventory. This approach allowed the company, by 1914, according to most historical accounts, to become the largest bicycle manufacturer in the country, controlling more than a quarter of the domestic market. That position was not secured by being the cheapest option on a showroom floor. It was secured by a calculation, made early and held to consistently, that a customer who trusted a Schwinn to last would return to the brand and recommend it to others, a strategy that traded short-term margin for long-term market share in a way that was unusual for a consumer goods firm of that era. The 1930s delivered the company's most consequential design decade, even though it coincided with the worst economic contraction in the nation's history. Rather than retreating from investment, Schwinn used the Depression years to reposition the bicycle as something more than a utilitarian machine. It became, in the company's own marketing and in the design language of its top models, an object of aspiration for American children and teenagers. The 1934 Aerocycle, with its streamlined tank and styling drawn explicitly from contemporary aviation, and the 1936 Autocycle that followed it, borrowed visual cues from automobiles and airplanes, the most technologically prestigious machines of the era, and applied them to a product that an ordinary American family could plausibly afford to buy for a child. This was a deliberate act of cultural positioning. In a decade when industrial optimism was in short supply, Schwinn manufactured a small, affordable piece of it and sold it from neighborhood shops across the country. The approach proved commercially resilient through the worst years of the Depression and gave the company a design vocabulary, chrome accents, tank-style frames, faux aviation detailing that would echo through its products for the next 3 decades. The single most consequential operational innovation in the company's history arrived in 1938 when Schwinn introduced both the cantilever frame and the spring fork front suspension, often referred to in period literature as knee-action forks, on its top-line models. The cantilever frame redistributed structural stress across a curved lower tube and reinforcing braces in a way that allowed for a stronger ride at a comparable weight, and it became, within a few years, a design element copied across the American bicycle industry, to the point that, according to most accounts of the period, nearly every major domestic manufacturer adapted some version of it. Schwinn paired this structural innovation with a manufacturing process the company would later brand as electro-forging, in which frame tubes were welded and then electrically fused into a single, nearly seamless structural unit rather than brazed at the joints in the traditional manner. The process reduced labor costs at scale, increased consistency between units, and produced a frame that resisted the joint failures that had been a common complaint about cheaper bicycles for decades. Together, these innovations gave Schwinn both a durability advantage that consumers could feel and a manufacturing efficiency advantage that protected its margins, a combination that is difficult to achieve and that defined the company's competitive identity for a generation. The 2.5 decades following the Second World War represented the period in which Schwinn was most thoroughly woven into the daily texture of American life. The post-war suburban expansion put millions of new families into single-family homes on streets built explicitly for residential use, and the bicycle became, for an entire generation of American children, the first vehicle they owned and the first measure of independent mobility they experienced. Schwinn bicycles were sold through a network of thousands of independent dealers, a distribution model the company had cultivated for decades and continued to defend even as discount retailers began to challenge it. And the company's production facilities in Chicago ran at a scale that made it, by multiple contemporary accounts, the most recognized bicycle name in the country. The company's marketing during these years leaned deliberately on themes of American childhood, neighborhood community, and generational continuity. A son or daughter receiving the same brand of bicycle a parent had once ridden. And that messaging, repeated across two post-war generations, built a depth of brand association that few consumer goods companies of any category have matched before or since. No single Schwinn product embodied the company's reach into ordinary American life more durably than the line of balloon tire cruisers that ran from the late 1940s through the 1950s, anchored by the Black Phantom, introduced in 1949 and produced for roughly a decade afterward. Marketed at the time as the most beautiful bicycle in America, the Black Phantom combined chrome-plated steel fenders with integrated headlamps, a sprung leather saddle, white-walled tires, and a rear luggage rack, and it was priced and positioned as an aspirational purchase that a family might save toward over months. It was not the company's highest volume product, and it was not inexpensive relative to median household incomes of the period, but it became, in the decades that followed, the visual shorthand for an entire era of American boyhood. Chrome, weight, presence, and the unmistakable sense that a bicycle could be a status object as much as a means of transportation. Surviving examples remain among the most sought-after vintage American bicycles in the collector market today, a fact that itself testifies to how firmly the model lodged itself in the national memory of mid-century childhood. By the early 1960s, American consumer tastes were shifting again, this time toward youth culture, customization, and a visual style imported informally from Southern California, where teenagers had begun modifying their bicycles with long banana seats, raised handlebars, and smaller wheels to resemble the drag racing motorcycles then capturing the public imagination. Schwinn product manager Al Fritz observed this informal trend and proposed that the company manufacture a factory version of it. The result, introduced in 1963, was the Stingray, and its commercial reception exceeded even optimistic internal projections. Published accounts describe sales reaching well over 40,000 units within roughly a year of launch, and approaching 2 million units across the model's first 5 years on the market, making it, by most measures, the best-selling bicycle the company ever produced. At the same time, Schwinn addressed the adult sport bicycle market with the Varsity and Continental, 10-speed models introduced beginning in 1960 that, while heavier than the European racing bicycles they visually imitated, sold in very large numbers through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, and became the company's leading models for the broader adult market during that period. Beneath the surface of this commercial success, however, structural pressures were accumulating that would eventually overwhelm the company. Schwinn's Chicago manufacturing plant, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, was operating in a building roughly 80 years old, equipped with machinery and inventory control systems that had not kept pace with the more automated and more efficient factories then being built by both domestic and overseas competitors. Multiple first-hand accounts from workers describe a physical plant in a state of real deterioration, inadequate heating during Chicago winters, and gaps in flooring large enough that dropped components could fall through to workers on the level below. In 1980, the plant's labor force, previously represented by an independent union, voted to affiliate with the United Auto Workers, and the resulting wage dispute produced a strike that lasted approximately 13 weeks. The strike did lasting damage to the relationship between the company's management and its production workforce, and it accelerated a decision that management had reportedly already been weighing, to begin shifting bicycle production away from the aging Chicago facility and toward lower-cost manufacturing locations, both domestic and overseas. The institutional consequence of that decision arrived in stages across the 1980s. Schwinn closed its century-old Chicago manufacturing plant in 1983 and began relocating production to a newly built facility in Greenville, Mississippi, while simultaneously expanding its reliance on overseas contract manufacturers in Taiwan, Hungary, and mainland China. The strategy was intended to reduce labor costs and modernize production, but the documented result was inconsistent. Overseas suppliers frequently struggled to meet delivery schedules, and the bicycles that arrived were, according to multiple contemporaneous trade accounts, often of noticeably lower build quality than customers had come to associate with the Schwinn name. The company that had spent 6 decades building its reputation on the reliability of what came out of its own factory now found that reputation eroding because of decisions made in pursuit of cost efficiency, a structural contradiction that would prove very difficult to reverse once underway. Because trust in a consumer brand, once damaged by inconsistent product quality, tends to dissipate far faster than it was originally built. By the early 1990s, the cumulative effect of those choices, layered on top of broader shifts in the bicycle market that Schwinn had been slow to anticipate, particularly the rapid rise of mountain biking and the move toward lighter, more technically engineered adult bicycles, had become a documented financial crisis. Industry and press accounts from the period describe the company's annual unit sales falling from roughly 1 million bicycles in 1987 to approximately 500,000 by 1991 and to around 275,000 by 1993, while its share of the domestic market fell to roughly 5%. The company reported losses of approximately $50 million over the 3 years preceding 1992, including a loss of about $25 million in 1992 alone, and it carried debts reported at approximately $75 to $82 million, while losing close to $1 million per month. On October 7, 1992, Schwinn, a firm that had been in continuous family ownership for nearly a century, filed for protection under Chapter 11 of the Federal Bankruptcy Code. The institutional aftermath of the 1992 filing permanently ended the Schwinn family's century-long ownership of the company that bore its name. In 1993, the Zell-Chilmark Investment Partnership acquired Schwinn's assets out of bankruptcy for approximately $67 million, restructuring the company as a financial asset rather than a family enterprise. That ownership did not prove durable either. In 1997, the company, by then operating as Schwinn Cycle and Fitness, was sold again to the Quester Partners Fund for a reported $86 million, and in 2001, during a second bankruptcy proceeding, the Schwinn and GT brands were sold to Pacific Cycle for a similarly reported figure near $86 million. Each of these transactions reflected the same underlying reality. Schwinn's name and brand recognition retained substantial market value even as its manufacturing base, its balance sheet, and its century-old ownership structure had effectively dissolved. The company, in other words, survived as an idea and a trademark considerably longer than it survived as the integrated American manufacturer it had been for most of its history. The Pacific Cycle acquisition placed Schwinn inside a much larger and more diversified corporate structure. Pacific Cycle itself became a subsidiary of Dorel Industries, a Canadian consumer products conglomerate, in 2004, and the Schwinn brand was folded into a portfolio that also included Mongoose, GT, and other bicycle and juvenile products labels. Within this new arrangement, Schwinn ceased to function as a vertically integrated manufacturer and instead became principally a brand and design operation. Bicycles bearing the Schwinn name were now designed domestically but manufactured by contract producers, predominantly in Asia, and distributed through a mix of specialty retailers and large general merchandise chains, rather than the network of dedicated independent dealers that had defined the company for most of the 20th century. This represented less a single dramatic rupture than a slow but cumulative reorientation. The same brand, the same name, the same visual identity in many cases, attached to a fundamentally different kind of company than the one Ignaz Schwinn had built. The most ambitious modern expression of the Schwinn name has not been any single bicycle, but the brand's migration into the indoor fitness category, a move that began modestly in the 1960s with the Schwinn Exerciser stationary bicycle and accelerated dramatically from the 1990s onward as group indoor cycling classes, popularized under licensed names such as spinning, became a fixture of American gyms and home fitness routines. This shift allowed the Schwinn name to retain commercial relevance in a market segment entirely distinct from the one that had built the brand, trading on consumer recognition built up over a century, even as the underlying product category, manufacturing base, and customer relationship had all changed. The fitness equipment line has, by some measures, become at least as commercially significant to the modern Schwinn brand as its traditional bicycle business, though precise figures broken out by category are not consistently disclosed in public filings, and any specific revenue comparison between the two lines should be treated as an estimate rather than a documented fact. The scale of the modern Schwinn-branded enterprise is difficult to state with the same precision that was possible when the company filed standalone financial reports as an independent manufacturer. As of the most recent ownership transition in 2021, Pon Holdings, a Dutch conglomerate, acquired Pacific Cycle and its associated brands, including Schwinn, Mongoose, and Roadmaster, from Dorel Industries as part of an approximately $810 million purchase of Dorel's broader sporting goods division. Schwinn-branded products are today sold across a wide range of price points and retail channels in the United States and internationally, but the brand no longer discloses unit sales, employment figures, or manufacturing locations with the specificity that was once standard for an independently reporting American industrial company, a function of its current status as one label within a much larger, privately structured portfolio. Readers seeking precise current figures should treat any specific number as provisional and subject to revision as ownership structures continue to evolve. Beyond its consumer identity, the Schwinn name carries a less publicized but well-documented civic dimension. For more than a century, the bicycle as a category, and Schwinn specifically, given its market dominance through most of that period, served as a primary instrument of independent mobility for American children, a low-cost entry point into physical activity for families across a wide range of incomes, and particularly during the gasoline shortages of the 1970s and in recurring periods of urban congestion since, a genuine alternative form of transportation for adult commuters. The company's century-long emphasis on durability, while it ultimately became a competitive liability when production quality declined in the 1980s, also meant that millions of Schwinn bicycles built across the mid-20th century remained functional and in circulation for decades, handed down, repaired, and resold within communities in a way that few other consumer durables of comparable original cost have matched. That afterlife, largely undocumented in corporate records, but visible in collector communities, second-hand markets, and the simple persistence of old Schwinns in American garages, represents one of the brand's most concrete and least celebrated contributions to ordinary national life. What the modern Schwinn brand has not resolved, and what remains, by any reasonable reading of the public record, an open question, is whether a name built on a century of in-house American manufacturing can retain its original meaning once that manufacturing has been entirely outsourced, and the company exists primarily as a licensed trademark inside a much larger consumer products group. Industry observers and longtime customers have, in published accounts spanning several decades, continued to debate whether contemporary Schwinn-branded bicycles meet the durability standard the name once represented, and the company's recurring changes of ownership, 5 distinct corporate parents across roughly 3 decades, have made it difficult for any single management team to commit to a long-term answer to that question. This is not a contradiction unique to Schwinn. It is a pattern documented across a great many American manufacturing brands that survived the late 20th century wave of deindustrialization by separating their names from their factories. But it is, for a brand whose entire original value proposition rested on the trustworthiness of what came out of its own plant, a particularly pointed, unresolved tension. A direct accounting of Schwinn's relationship with the public record produces a ledger that runs in both directions. On the side of contribution, the company provided sustained industrial employment to thousands of Chicago workers for the better part of a century, paid wages sufficient to support working-class families in one of the country's major manufacturing cities, and produced a category of product, the durable, affordable bicycle, that materially improved the daily mobility of American children and adults across multiple generations. Its frame innovations of the 1930s diffused broadly across the entire industry, raising baseline quality standards for competitors as well as the company itself. And its post-war market dominance, whatever its later competitive consequences, meant that a reliable, well-built bicycle was accessible to American families at a price point that remained modest relative to median household incomes through most of the 1950s and 1960s. On the side of costs externalized, the company's management decisions in the 1980s effectively transferred the risk of its strategic repositioning onto its workforce, whose jobs were eliminated when the Chicago plant closed, and onto its supplier network, whose relationships were disrupted as production migrated overseas. The quality deterioration that followed the offshoring strategy imposed costs on consumers who purchased bicycles in good faith under a name that had historically warranted trust, and the 2 bankruptcies, in 1992 and again in 2001, imposed documented losses on creditors, suppliers, and institutional investors. No specific figure for aggregate employee displacement or supplier losses from the 1983 plant closure and subsequent restructuring appears in readily accessible public records, and any precise estimate should be treated as provisional. What the record does clearly show is that those costs were real, that they were borne by parties other than the company's ownership, and that they were a direct consequence of decisions made at the management level. Taken as a whole, the documented record of the Schwinn name shows a company that, for the first 90 years of its existence, did something genuinely difficult. It built a reputation for mechanical trustworthiness in a crowded, low-margin consumer category, sustained that reputation across changes in technology, taste, and national circumstance, and in doing so became something closer to a fixture of American childhood than a conventional commercial brand. It also shows a company that in its final 2 decades of independent operation made a series of cost-driven decisions, plant closures, offshored production, and adversarial turn in labor relations that measurably eroded the very quality association that had been its core asset, and that ultimately could not survive as an integrated American manufacturer once that asset had been spent. The thread connecting Ignaz Schwinn's small Chicago partnership of 1895 to the Schwinn-branded products sold under Pawn Holdings ownership in the present day remains, in a narrow legal and commercial sense, unbroken. In every other sense, ownership, manufacturing, labor, geography, it has been rewoven so many times that very little of the original fabric remains. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the name still carries weight in American memory, that the weight was earned honestly across most of a century, and that what the name is now attached to is, by any factual accounting, a considerably different enterprise than the one that earned it.